further ado, let's get into this. We've got a really exciting event with Cecilia Eve representing the Fabian Society IPG and Benjamin Harris Quinney from the Bow Group. So let's just get into it. I'll take 2 minutes to frame the questions at hand and kind of set the kind of framework within which we'll be discussing. And then each participant will be given 9 minutes to say what their view of foreign policy should be. And just a reminder that I will be policing this time limit quite closely, so please don't go over, you will get notified. Anyway, so without further ado, so we'll move on to the question of Britain, how Britain should position itself with regard to the new administration in the US. So Biden looks to be very much involved in foreign policy terms, legacy as Obama's vice president. He was very important as regards the Paris climate talks in 2016, very involved in policymaking with regard to America's so-called forever wars. But he's going to face increasing calls from across Washington to retrench on global commitments, increasingly from the leftist side of the political party. Biden has throughout his career deep involvement with the British Isles, in particular, deep affinity for the island of Ireland, and he's already signalled a kind of very early on that he would not look fondly on any Brexit proposal that jeopardises the Good Friday Agreement. So how does that play out and things? Some suggestions that Biden and his team, Blinken, Sullivan, and now Lloyd Austin, are looking to establish deep connections with France at the expense. What does that mean for how Britain sees itself within the special relationship? Indeed, some British circles, there is dislike for Biden, as he was forever the US official that said Obama had a dislike of the UK due to his deep, quote, ancestral hatred of the British Empire. Should Britain put individuals behind and seek to kind of continue being the bridge between the US and Europe, clearly delineated by people like Blair in 1997, but even beyond that with Macmillan? Or should the UK seek to have a more independent foreign policy free from the shackles of this special relationship? With that, I will hand over to Benjamin Harris Quinney to take us in to this discussion, and you'll have 9 minutes starting when you're ready. I think you're on mute. I think you're on mute still.
Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Oliver, for that introduction. My apologies to those watching. Not only have I let myself go during lockdown and am in a hirsute state, but also my camera appears very dark, which will only add to the Bond villain aspect of how I'm often portrayed on campus. But I think this is actually one of the most interesting times in British history to discuss the future of our foreign policy, because we are on a precipice on so many fronts, as is being encapsulated by this debate. I think there are more than the three big questions that are being asked, but they are probably the three biggest questions. We face a situation where we have to, the government of the United Kingdom has to remake its relationship with the government of the United States. We're obviously coming to the very end of a tether in terms of what our relationship with the European Union will be going forward. And I think there has been, over the last few years, confusion and ambivalence over our policy towards China. On the question of the United States, I think there has been a degree of hyperbole in our media and international media about how a Boris Johnson government will sync up with a Biden government. Boris Johnson is a liberal, and if he was in the United States, he would be a Democrat. So this idea that he is Britain's Trump and he is someone that was completely aligned with Trump and therefore won't align with Biden, I think is incorrect. In fact, if you look across the British cabinet, I think the vast majority of them are very similar to Biden on most policy issues. Biden really for the Democrats was a compromise candidate, a throwback. I think. I don't think he represents what the future of the Democrat Party will look like. But in equal measure, if he was in the United Kingdom, I think there's a very strong likelihood that he would be in the Conservative Party, on the left of the Conservative Party, a sort of Anna Soubry type figure, perhaps not currently in the Conservative Party, but until recently in the Conservative Party. And therefore, I think that leaving aside the specificity of foreign policy issues, in terms of the view of the world, and in terms of the personalities, I don't think there's any impediment to the UK government working with Biden or his administration. I think Biden will go straight back into things like the Paris Accords and various UN pacts, and of course the United Kingdom is already in all of those agreements. And in the case of some of them, and indeed against the will of much of the British public, was a leading protagonist of things like the Marrakesh Pact on immigration, and obviously Boris Johnson has certainly put forward the proposition that he is very committed to the green agenda. Which obviously very much syncs up with the Paris Accords. I think the big issue will be how the United States chooses to position itself. Barack Obama, many will recall, mentioned the European Union or Angela Merkel as the United States' closest allies when he was president, despite the fact that he of course spied on Merkel. And I think there will be a desire in the Biden administration to re-establish that connection with the European Union, and I think they will do that quite strongly. I think they will make a big song and dance about it, and will present to the world the notion that the European Union is the United States' biggest partner on the world stage. And I think they will do that not just because there's a lot of truth in that from a Democrat point of view, but because they will want to make a clear signal that they're departing from the policies of the Trump administration. So that will, of course, place the United Kingdom in a difficult position with regards to the Brexit deal that's being done, and the very decent possibility of a no-deal Brexit. You mentioned previously Biden's concerns over Northern Ireland. I think the more significant concerns really relate to the fact that Biden wants the United Kingdom will want the United Kingdom to rejoin the European Union, and I think he will certainly not want to support the process of Brexit in the way that President Trump has very vocally. I think it was one of the greatest foreign policy failings of the last few decades for the United Kingdom not to have secured a trade deal with the United States whilst Trump was president. He was clearly signalling his willingness to do so. I think part of our inability to do so stems from the fact that certainly Theresa May and to some extent Boris were very wary about sidling up close to President Trump. As I say, despite hyperbole in the press, Trump's politics are completely different to that of Theresa May and Boris Johnson. And partially because there was this legal sense and certainly notion that we couldn't be doing any trade deals until the deal with the European Union was settled. But I think that was a mistake. I think any penalties that would have come from negotiating a trade deal with the United States would be far outweighed by the benefits. And of course, in terms of making Brexit a success in the short term, the United States is the only market, if we have a no-deal Brexit, but even if we rebalance our trade away from the European Union with a deal, which was much of the argument for Brexit, there are a few countries like the United States that can provide that instant replication of standards of products and trade and the type of products that British people tend to buy as the United States. So I don't think that things will be as harsh from the Biden administration as Barack Obama suggested, i.e. you'll be at the back of the queue. I don't think that Biden will be completely unwilling to do a trade deal, but I think he will be thinking first about the European Union rather than the United Kingdom in doing that trade deal. So that is a big blow, I think, to this government. I am a Brexiteer and have been a Brexiteer for a long time, but Peter Hitchens, also a Brexiteer, put forward the notion that he was against Brexit because he didn't feel that the modern Conservative Party and the government of the day was in any way adept enough to deliver it. And certainly that argument now seems fairly accurate. I think the way that Brexit has been handled and the way that trade deals, like the deal with the United States, but also beyond the United States, have been embraced and progressed by this government has frankly been appalling. We still haven't really left the European Union, and it's been 4 years. I think there is finally the realization in the Conservative Party that they have to leave, and they have to leave on the latest extension that they have agreed. But that was a sort of minimum requirement. The maximum requirement, or the reasonable requirement, would be making a solid position for Britain in the world post Brexit. And so, looking beyond that, what I'm concerned about is that the United Kingdom will be, to some extent, desperate to continue the preeminent relationship with the United States, and that's where we've seen foreign policy errors before.
With your time, Ben.
I'm sorry?
That's your time, Ben.
Okay, I was just going to say that's where we've seen foreign policy errors before, with issues like the Iraq War, when Blair was obviously far too keen on retaining that relationship with the United States, and it led to major foreign policy errors and misadventures, which I think we are in danger of repeating.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'll hand over to Cecilia.
Thanks very much, Ollie, and also to Tom for organising this with the great KCL Diplomacy Society. So, quick introduction, as I haven't really covered what the Fabian Society do or me. So, who am I? What's the Fabian Society before I launch in? I'm a senior policy advisor about to transfer across to DEFRA, Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, leading teams on the UK-EU transition process that we're talking about right now. And I write freelance occasionally for publications like Global Politics, the Oxford Political Review, and most recently iGlobal News on things like women's rights, climate change, and international relations. So the Fabian Society, for which I'm vice chair of the Young Fabians National Executive Committee, is a progressive think tank whose 7,000 members include Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, multiple lords, representatives, academics, policymakers, and activists. We chair free events with MPs pretty much every single week. We host workshops like advocacy and public speaking, plus talks and socials, and we have our own dedicated magazine called Antics, or Anticipations. So we publish policy pamphlets on a regular basis that shape the direction of the left. So to dive into this question, it's probably quite obvious that I'm a Remainer, and we have definitely changed our position on the world stage. We'll be leaving on the 31st of December, whether we like it or not. So that's something we're all in agreement with. And I suppose if the question is, should we mimic the incoming Biden administration's approach post-Trump? An attempt to be more multilateral and a credible actor My answer is simply yes. So looking at the foreign policy between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, it's obviously pretty different. Biden seeks to rebuild trust in US leadership and restore its traditional position as a world leader, whereas Trump pulls out of treaties, reneges on promises, for example, on repealing Obamacare and investing in infrastructure. He alienates allies and abdicates from US global responsibilities. Another example of Trump's actions on the world stage is the global gag law, which you might have heard of. The banning of US aid to any country which even provides information about abortions, let alone performing them. And when women are forced to seek unsafe abortions, it can be fatal. In Dakar, Senegal, for example, volunteers reported a huge rise in unsafe abortions, teenage pregnancies, and STIs in an impoverished neighborhood which previously 3 out of 5 clinics had been funded by the IPPF, which is now closed. Globally, an average of 70,000 women a year die from unsafe abortions, which of course happen when governments have criminalized them or, via USAID, have simply refused to provide them. So back to Biden. Once he's sworn in, as Ben commented, Biden will he's going to issue a series of executive orders, including that he will rejoin the Paris Climate Agreement and push for more ambitious targets, which is really welcome news. With regard to COVID-19, Biden pledges to rejoin the WHO, World Health Organization, and promises to coordinate a global response led by the US Agency for International Development, USAID. And he also aims to pursue an extension for the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, otherwise known as START, and resuscitate the Iran nuclear deal, if possible, to undo the jeopardization of non-proliferation by Trump, who obviously abandoned it. So I'd like to give you 3 reasons why we should take a more multilateral stance. 1, COVID-19 is a perfect example of why we need a coordinated global response. We all had to respond to it, but it struck at different intensities, at different times, and in different geopolitical regions. For example, at the HIMSS Health 2.0 European Digital Conference, healthcare leaders from Australia, India, and the UK compared notes about their own respective experiences building digital maturity and shared best practice for response. Australia was behind us in the onset of the pandemic, and so was able to learn from us in what worked and what didn't. So to counter the virus, they pledged to share information and spread what worked, what didn't, and squelch inaccurate information, because obviously disinformation has been a massive problem as well. COVID is a hoax, anti-vaxxers, etc. And defense members from the 10-member Association of Southeast Nations, the ASEAN, banded together to fight the COVID-19 pandemic response by calling on regional governments and health officials to work more closely together. It's not every woman or man for her or himself, it's an international issue, and only by working together can we collectively overcome it. For example, the Pfizer vaccine. Don't take it from me. There's a reason why 172 economies now engaged in discussions to participate in COVAX, the global initiative aimed at providing countries worldwide equitable access to vaccines. So, secondly, not a small issue, climate change. In an ever more internally focused, nationalistic and individualist world, the challenges to find global solutions is huge. The COVID-19 crisis is but a drop in the rapidly acidifying ocean compared to the ramifications we will face if we disregard climate change and the crucial window we have to mitigate its effects. We've had emission reduction targets repeatedly missed, documents referring to climate change redacted under a Trump administration, environmental fines ignored, And loads of companies who are responsible for unprecedented levels of destruction don't even have environmental policy frameworks. Why does this matter? As a result, 250,000 people a year, as a very conservative estimate, are dying from climate change. So what does that make it? A human rights issue. Take it from 197 signatory countries to the Paris Climate Agreement. This matters, and we need a multilateral stance on it. And finally, what the UN calls the shadow pandemic. As one of the UK delegates for the British South Asian Youth Summit with Virendra Sharma, MP, and Baroness Verma, who is chair of UN Women, myself and 9 other countries came together to discuss how we end violence against women and girls. Make no mistake, the pandemic has not been the great leveler we are told it was. COVID-19 has both exposed and exacerbated existing stark inequalities that tear apart the fabric of our society. And it has quickly become clear that the impact of the pandemic on women is vastly incommensurate with that on men. Data from the United Nations has already shown that all forms of violence against women are up globally. So FGM, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, domestic violence, intimate partner violence, and femicide. Congresswoman Martha Tagle from Mexico said, "The deadliest pandemic for women in our country, more than the coronavirus, is feminicidal violence." Right here in the UK, Karen and Gala Smith, who founded the pioneering project Counting Dead Women, found that femicide has tripled recently, with 16 women murdered over the same period compared to 5 in the same period last year. We've seen it across the world. Spain with the Masserilla 19 campaign, which is like our UK Boots one. You have to go in and ask for something specific, which is a way of reporting you are a victim. You've had Mexico, 1,000 women killed since the start of the year, and this was back in March. It's been insane. There's been an insidious narrative in the media as well, attributing murders to COVID-19 rather than male perpetrators. So to wrap up, this pandemic, the shadow pandemic, and the literal future of our planet are at stake. We should definitely treasure the alliance that we have with the US. It is incredibly, incredibly valuable for us, both economically, diplomatically, and in terms of shared intelligence. But the two, great, I'll just quick one sentence, I promise. But the two, being multilateral and also cooperating with the US, are not mutually exclusive. We can't change minds or inform discussion if we're not in the room. So yes, I'm absolutely for working with the Biden administration to put the world to rights, to be quite honest. We can't, and in terms of the global stage, we can't lead if we've left.
Thank you, Cecilia. We will now move on to the section of questions that look at Britain's foreign policy to the EU, Brexit, and trade with Europe. And just as a way of framing this, at the present vantage point, it seems that Brexit negotiations could go either way. It seems likely that Britain will face either a no-deal Brexit or the thinnest of deals to provide a sort of framework to build on future negotiations. Either way, Britain will be facing a very different relationship with its biggest trade partner, which includes some of its closest security partners. How should it do this? Should it rework its relations with the EU, or work to build closer relations bilaterally with the likes of France and Germany? To what extent should Britain lend assistance to kind of European issues such as a revanchist Russia, or kind of rejuvenating a more European-looking NATO? Or should it kind of collaborate on aerospace projects, for example? If there are shared security threats, to what extent can these be divorced from trade or economic policy more broadly? So ultimately, what does Britain's future relationship with Europe look like? I've seen that Thomas wants to make a point. Is that a housekeeping point, Thomas?
Yeah, I just wanted to just inform everyone that the meeting is being recorded. I forgot to tell them that at the beginning. So just a quick just note. But other than that, yeah, please continue.
Perfect. Well, Ben went first last time, so I'll let Cecilia lead and then Ben respond. Over to you, Cecilia. You have 9 minutes.
Sure. Thanks, Ollie. So a lot of ground to kind of cover there. I'll start with your last point. So should trade basically dominate in relation to deals over other points? So I would always put people before profit, and I would always put planet before profit. We've got an example right here where we sell loads of arms to Saudi Arabia, a place where there are massive human rights violations. Torture is used as a punishment, executions, women are widely discriminated against, as we well know. And you've got the Absha app, for example, where Saudi women are required to have a male guardian and can't leave the country unless a male guardian actually allows them to do so. So where human rights violations are happening, it is imperative that we actually look at what is the opportunity cost of us losing a trade deal or making a trade deal when we are complicit in that. So in terms of Brexit, as Ben said, we obviously have much more of a need now to make new trade negotiations, to make deals, and I would agree on a basic level that it is a shame that we didn't create a trade deal with America, but that may be incoming. We'll have to see. We've already signed an interim trade deal with Japan, and we're looking at others further afield. In terms of the EU, well, there's a lot to be said there. I think you can look at the EU as a bloc. You can also obviously pick out foreign particular countries, as Ollie said, Germany or France, and try to make negotiations with them. But it depends what you're trying to achieve. We need them as a bloc more than they need us. There's 27 EU member states, and we're only one country. We're now basically on our own, and we need to foster international relationships as much as possible rather than severing them. We've signed an interim agreement with Norway and Iceland already to support trade in goods and minimise cost to businesses and consumers from the start of 2021. So that continuity deal is worth about 27 billion, which is brilliant for us. And we won't have any taxes or duties on 95% of Norwegian goods and 90% of Icelandic goods, including fish fillets. So that is good progress. Japan is good progress. But we did make mistakes when it came to Brexit, when it came to negotiating this trade deal. The government admitted it would break international law by changing a treaty they only signed a year ago with the EU, the Internal Market Bill. That would give ministers powers to make regulations about state aid and customs procedures for trade from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, and would allow ministers to make regulations inconsistent with the UK's obligations under the withdrawal agreement. And the existence of those powers is a breach of Article 4 of the withdrawal agreement. So which is that the UK must use primary legislation to give full effect to it in domestic law. So not only does it breach international law, it sets the groundwork for further breaches, more extensive breaches, and tries to insulate ministers from any kind of scrutiny. And that's not right. Even Theresa May warned that would damage our international credibility and standing. And she's right. It's something that me and her very rarely agree on. How can we challenge human rights violations or any other breach of agreement internationally in any other country or bloc when we're admitting that we broke the law in the first place in a limited and specific way? And it's also not without economic ramifications. Sterling slipped for the first time since it was announced, and it was down about 0.3% and dropped below the $1.30 level for the first time since late July. We lost ground to the euro as well, down 0.2%. So we need to tread carefully. We can't just circumvent Parliament. We can't just push through things and change our minds as a government. We can't just act like Donald Trump and think that we can just withdraw from things and that there'll be no effects to that. If we want to build new relationships with countries, with blocs, with countries further afield that we don't particularly have huge historic trade agreements with or alliances with, then we need to set ourselves out on the world stage with credibility, with trust, and honor our promises, whether that's historic ones or future ones. And that's kind of the end of what I've got to say on that. Your time.
Perfect. I'll hand over to Ben.
Thank you, Oliver. I have to say that the early part of some of your questions you were breaking up on my end, so I didn't get all of them. But to look at the situation in the round with regards to Britain's foreign policy approach to the European Union. Clearly, this is a most open question in that I remember that an ambassador approached the Bow Group to ask what was going on inside the UK government and what decisions they would likely to be making on Brexit in terms of a trade deal with the European Union. And the reality is that at the moment, I think as far as anyone can tell, in number 10, they don't know. The people in Brussels don't know. And so there is, at this time, I think, a very good chance that a no-deal Brexit will occur. It is important to say that very often in trade deals, particularly those that are somewhat acrimonious or entrenched, like the process that we've seen between Britain and the European Union, a lot of progress does tend to be made at the very last minute. And just today, we've seen the UK government pull back from what Cecilia was mentioning there, which was the particular internal market bill that deals with Northern Ireland. I think it was there was slight confusion on that issue generally publicly, because what the UK government was saying was that in the event of a no-deal Brexit, the UK government reserves the right to centralise the control and the regulation of our market, which would include Northern Ireland, and therefore whilst it is debated in international law, the position that Theresa May and Boris Johnson have put forward is nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Therefore, treaties that relate to Britain's relationship to the European Union in the event of a no-deal Brexit are therefore null and void. But as I say, today they've pulled back from that position. Maybe you could say it was brinkmanship. They'd added that in as a negotiation position that they then knew they would pull back from. We don't know. I think, again, there's a lot of hyperbole in this debate. There's a lot of adversarial elements to the debate that don't really exist and are not particularly helpful. I think ultimately, you've got a situation where the United Kingdom is in the midst of the COVID crisis and therefore a recession as well. The same is true for the European Union. You can debate who needs who more, but ultimately it would be to the benefit of both parties that we have a reasonable trading agreement going forward. And I think that is what most people we don't want a bad deal. The majority of the British public don't want a bad deal, and they think that no deal should be on the table in the event that a bad deal is presented. But I think in an ideal world, most people want a trade agreement with the European Union so that we can see minimum friction when it comes to trade with them. And whatever happens, however big a trade deal we do with the United States, however big a trade deal we do with places like India, the European Union is still going to be a major trading partner for the United Kingdom. Whether you want to see it as a bloc, as the European Union, or the constituent nations within. And I think that's an important point with our relationship with the EU going forward. The European Union is not united on any issue, and that's really been its historic problem. So you've got countries like Hungary, the Visegrad Group, Hungary, Poland, that are not in agreement with a lot of the social policies and the policies on immigration. And there are obviously stark differences between the economies within the European Union. So from the United Kingdom's point of view, I think there is the potential there, whilst because they're part of the European Union, they won't be able to do individual trade deals with us, we can still come to trade agreements with those individual constituent nations. And I think what I'm seeing is a desire to reach out to the individual nations. There is a very strong perception. I have spent a lot of time in Spain. Part of my family is Spanish, and when we left the European Union, there was the perception, certainly in Spain, and I think in many other countries throughout the EU, that this was in some way a repudiation of those individual countries, that it was an insult to those individual countries. And I really don't think that's the case. I think for the vast majority of Brexiteers, we hated the EU, but loved Europe, and therefore loved the constituent nations of Europe. And so I'm hoping that post-Brexit we can get into a situation where, at the very least, the bilateral relations between the United Kingdom and Spain, the United Kingdom and Italy, the United Kingdom and Germany will improve considerably, because Brexit is the only issue at the moment. We can't get past that. But once that issue is settled, I think there's huge potential to dialogue with those individual constituent nations. And not only to trade with them, but also to partner with them on many international projects. Although I do think there is a caution to be made on this sort of push to internationalism that we've seen with Cecilia, which is that the British public do not want to see the extent of international partnerships and international projects that are currently being pushed at UN level and at EU level. Things like the EU Army, for example, was an issue that was very unpopular, an idea that was very unpopular in Britain. And I think the same is true of things like the UN Pact on migration. There was we saw in the recent budget statement by the Chancellor a reduction of the commitment to international aid. There were several polls done alongside that. One by ITV found that 85% of the British public wanted to see international aid cut. Another poll done by YouGov, I think it came out 66% wanted to see it cut. Only 18% wanted to see it continue in its current form. Now you can debate the validity of polls, but I think the feeling among the British public is that we need to refocus our attention, particularly in the context of the coronavirus crisis and the economic crisis that comes alongside that, on the United Kingdom. And we should be refocusing our resources on the United Kingdom and the most needy in our country. So I would caution against the government going headlong into some of these global schemes that don't have the consent of the British public. But with that said, there are a lot of common sense projects, if you like, that I think we can be working with certainly the constituent nations of Europe on. Cecilia mentioned it herself. There are a variety of issues when it comes to human rights abuses that I don't think there's any disagreement on. Things like female genital mutilation. I don't think there's any strong lobby for that continuing within Europe. I think there's also a question which hasn't been touched upon as to the extent to which we would want to partner with the European Union if they are able to create a cohesive European army, whether that European army will be as close a partner as the United States has been to the United Kingdom, or whether there will be divergence on global foreign policy aims and the military objectives. We're going to go on, I know, to talk about this with regard to China, but certainly it's very clear that China is moving into the position of being a regional hegemon. We've seen the issues with Hong Kong. I think those issues are going to go forward with places like Taiwan. And so there is a big question as to whether the European Union will be a foreign policy military partner for the United Kingdom. And that's as much about the European Union forming that structure and setting its goals as it is for the United Kingdom.
Perfect, thank you. You provided an excellent segue there into the final topic of this evening, which is British foreign policy towards China. So just as a way of getting you thinking, in May of this year, Britain and Australia and Canada authored a joint statement expressing concern at the erosion of human rights in Hong Kong in the wake of the Beijing-directed national security legislation by the Hong Kong legislature. This signalled a marked end to the so-called golden era of UK-China relations enjoyed from 2010 to 2016, I would say. And as the UK looks to develop a new approach to China in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, capitals around the world are also re-evaluating. So the US State Department recently authored a Kennanite-esque fabled long telegram to draw parallels between the Soviet Union and today's China. France, for its part, in 2018, authored an Indo-Pacific strategy, had suggested a more active military role in the region, whilst Germany's own document has suggested a more cautious approach. And meanwhile, as we speak, Australia has faced kind of increasing ire from Beijing over its unwillingness to tread the so-called CCP line. So what should the integrated review that's ongoing at the moment, looking at foreign, defence, security and development policy, slated for early 2021, include on China, really? Should the UK take a tougher line with Beijing in defence of its historical and it should be said, legal commitments to Hong Kong? How can the UK do that? At the same time, the UK will need to ultimately cooperate with China and the US to prevent global temperatures rising above the maximum of 1.5 above pre-industrial levels, something of which Cecilia has already touched on. And similarly, is it really as easily as decoupling supply chains and reducing dependence on China, where it has cornered the market on renewable technologies and has a monopoly on rare earth metals? So really, what is the way ahead for UK-China policy? I will let Ben take us into this one.
Oh, well, thank you, Oliver. And I think this is the biggest question in a global sense for what we're debating today, because what we're seeing is the emergence of a bipolar power system, whereas the United States has been the preeminent global power since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and has since had no nation or no conglomerate of nations powerful enough to challenge it. With China, you certainly have a challenge to American power, and most definitely in the Asian region. So it is a new era for global foreign policy and the global power construct. The United Kingdom's policy towards China, as you alluded to, Oliver, David Cameron and George Osborne hugged China very close. That was a key foreign policy aim of their government. I think in the last few years we've seen inconsistency and flip-flopping. So you had the Hawaii issue in terms of the Chinese company Hawaii coming in to build a lot of the UK's 5G infrastructure and other telecoms infrastructures. When we pulled back from that, following really US pressure, I think that signalled a departure. That was the biggest signal to departure of the policy of Osborne and Cameron to court China. We also had the protests in Hong Kong and what many would consider human rights abuses taking place in Hong Kong from the Chinese government as they seek to pull Hong Kong closer and closer to the Chinese system rather than the independent or adjunct system. I think, frankly, that coronavirus has changed a lot of people's opinion of China as a result of the virus coming from there. So the United Kingdom is in a position as an independent nation, or it will be a completely independent nation after we leave the European Union, that has a choice to make as to whether it wants to throw in with the United States and probably the European Union in opposing or curtailing China's muscle flexing, or whether it wants to be a mercantile power that looks to simply benefit financially from trade relationships with China and looks the other way on a lot of issues like human rights and China's expansionism. I think one of the problems and one of the reasons you're seeing that incoherence and inconsistency is that I would argue the last 20 years at least of British foreign policy have been erroneous, in the sense that we've committed to international interventions under Tony Blair, the Iraq War, Afghanistan, and obviously under Cameron more recently, Libya, and also under Cameron, but also under May and Johnson. I think there has been a desire to commit more heavily to Syria that only was not met because of the significant public opinion against it. If you have, for example, a situation in 5 years' time, purely hypothetical, where China looks to increase its influence to dominate Taiwan, I think the problem for the United Kingdom and for Western powers generally is, whilst it is clear that that would be a major step towards Chinese dominance, complete dominance in Asia and partial dominance of the Pacific, I don't think there exists the desire in the public of the West to see another major intervention that would undoubtedly be very costly in terms of both blood and treasure. So that is going to be, I think, the big question for the West. To what extent do we push back against China, or to what extent do we throw in with China and move to a more interwoven global system in which trade is the greatest force, and national foreign policy is less significant. My feeling is that certainly the Trump administration put the threat of China's dominance at the heart of their foreign policy approach. I think Biden will pull back from that, but ultimately, if the United States does not curtail Chinese expansionism, the United States will cease to be the superpower that they have been for much of the last century. In terms of the more specific policy remedies, if you like, that might come from the UK government, we've seen on Hong Kong a condemnation of China's actions, and we've seen proposals to give a pathway to Hong Kong residents to migrate to the United Kingdom. However, what we've also seen is a situation with Brexit where trade deals with nations and constructs outside of the West are clearly more important to Britain than they once were. So my guess would be on foreign policy, from Britain to China, you will continually see a fairly inconsistent, incoherent fudge, whereby the United Kingdom will make statements on issues like human rights abuses in Hong Kong, but ultimately they will continue to trade with China and continue to have China as a key commercial partner. I think it will take a major incident like the one I mentioned if China moves into Taiwan to shift that position, because the way that China operates as a state is quite monolithic, whereas the way that modern Western powers, certainly European powers, tend to operate now is not so monolithic. So you have a variety of major companies in the UK that might well be trading with China, whether the UK government likes it or not. And I find it unlikely, given the fragile state of our finances and our economy because of the situation we're in. I find it unlikely that the UK government will hand down severe trade embargoes like the embargoes that Trump laid down because of the impact it would have on UK business. So I see that rumbling along of foreign policy towards China, where we speak out when things are really bad, but ultimately we allow trade and partnership to continue. I think there is a real issue with Chinese infiltration in the United Kingdom, everything from our top research universities to major financial institutions to major companies, and that goes back to the point of China acting as a monolith, where we are acting as a constellation of companies, of governments, of individuals that don't operate in the same way, and so they've been able to exploit that, and they were very close to being able to push through the Hawaii deal, which would make China a really major partner in the future of UK infrastructure. So I think if you're serious about taking on China, you would need to completely restructure the way the United Kingdom operates, and you would need to push forward a lot of measures that would be, I think, in the short term, very damaging to the economy. Would certainly see a restructuring of the economy. So it's a question that I don't see the United Kingdom having the wherewithal or having the courage to commit to challenging China.
Perfect. Thanks for that, Ben. I'll hand over to Cecilia now, when you're ready.
Thanks, Ollie. So, as Ben touched on, the question is basically, do we stand back? Do we stand aside? Do we turn a blind eye to what's going on in China? And I'll come back on a couple of those points, but I want to first start with a particular aspect that unites everyone here in this virtual room, and the very reason we are seeing each other in 2, not 3D, COVID-19. So I highly doubt there's anyone here who hasn't been affected by the pandemic in some way, even if indirectly. And before any assumptions are made, I absolutely do not blame China for the pandemic itself. Diseases have no nationality and no borders. However, as in life, it is about not so much the problem itself, but the way that you handle it. Chinese health officials knew that they were facing not a local disease, but a pandemic from a new coronavirus 6 days before warning the public. 3,000 people are believed to have been infected during the week of silence. And you know, I'm sure from many, many government videos about how quickly those infections spread and how just one person taken out of the chain, the link in the chain, can have huge effects. So Lord Patten, for example, he was the former governor of Hong Kong. He told BBC Panorama, frankly, thousands of people will have lost their lives and livelihoods because China did not behave as it promised it would behave according to international health regulations. Instead of giving other countries like ours the best possible chance for tackling this virus, which has now killed 1.6 million people worldwide, they chose to hide it. Those who survived know how bad it's been. The lockdowns we've been subjected to, unable to see our family, our friends, sometimes even not go to funerals. Countless businesses going under. People left, right and centre, losing their jobs. What are supposed to be the best of your life, years of your life in university, will have been irrevocably dampened by this. So I can only hope you found ways to still enjoy them. Quite simply, the Chinese government broke the rules. They had an obligation to collect data about its spread and promptly inform the WHO. Falsified and obfuscated data and repressed advanced warnings about the contagion as early as December, well before the start of the global pandemic. They also joined Moscow in exploiting confusion around the pandemic by engaging in information warfare through blatant fake news on the origins of the virus, even going so far as to suggest that it was developed as a tool for US biological warfare. One life lost that could have been avoided is one life too many. So yes, we need to hold them accountable. The next part of it is, so Ben said, well, you know, we'll say something when things are really bad, but ultimately you don't want this loss of blood and treasure. So I want to kind of come back on that. The next part of this question is a question of what kind of people we want to be. After Nazi Germany, the world said, never again. And yet over 1 million people, including Uyghurs, Kazakhs, and Christians, are currently incarcerated in secretive internment camps located in Xinjiang. Satellite imaging from the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has shown 380 internment camps still under construction, despite Chinese officials' claims that the re-education system is being wound down. It's hard to connect this with reality, I know. We've got a limited scope for emotive capacity, and this seems very distant, very far off, and so removed from our lives. So imagine for a second that it's happening right here. Imagine for one or other reason you don't eat pork, whether that's because you're vegan, vegetarian, or you're Muslim, or you just don't like it. That is a reason that you could be detained by the Chinese government for an indefinite amount of time, arbitrarily, and subjected to torture. There's an old man in there for paying his water bill late, and hundreds of thousands of people incarcerated for owning a Quran. You would also, if you decided not to eat pork, you get arrested, etc., you're in prison. But when you come out and you are relocated back into society, you would also have a Han Chinese official, so a UK policeman or woman, mostly men, come into your home and live there with you. So they would monitor you, basically. And we've seen tons of these policemen sexually assault Han Chinese women, especially when the men leave. Ethnic minority women aged from 19 to 59 are also forced to have intrauterine devices fitted or undergo sterilization. It's basically demographic genocide. In the Uyghur regions of Khotan and Kashgar, births collapsed by more than 60%. 60% between 2015 and 2018. Nationally, the births only fell 4.2%. So you can see how targeted it is. It's a systematic destruction of an ethnicity. And finally, as we touched on, Hong Kong. You may or may not have heard of this whole new national security law, which was kept secret until after it was passed. This is a law which, to quote our own government, lies in direct conflict with China's international obligations under the joint declaration which guaranteed Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy, with executive, legislative, and independent judicial powers until 2047. Let me just remind you of some of the offences that are banned and what punishments they carry. Okay, so if you're in China and you were found guilty of secession, which is breaking away from the government, or subversion, undermining the power or authority of central government, guess what you can get as a sentence? Maximum of life in prison. If you damage public transport facilities, this can be considered terrorism. Sorry, Banksy. If you're found guilty of any of these offences, you're also obviously not allowed to stand for public office, because we can't have that. People suspended for breaking the law can be wiretapped and put under surveillance. That's perfectly fine. Doesn't seem to be anything wrong with that. And Beijing will have its own law enforcement personnel there, which is not coming under the local authorities' jurisdiction. So basically a militant police force that Hong Kong has no power over. What this amounts to is a huge breach of the one country, two systems principle. These laws were introduced by decree, which means they bypass the city's parliament. And even better, Article 38. People from outside Hong Kong who are not permanent residents of Hong Kong, everyone here, unless you are from Hong Kong, obviously, also suggests that foreigners who support independence for Hong Kong or call for imposing sanctions on the Chinese government could be prosecuted from entering Hong Kong or mainland China. So if you supported Hong Kongese independence in any particular way, you're vocal enough to be noticed and fancied a holiday to China, make sure you have a long stay visa, because you might very well end up in prison for 6 months. This is a draconian global gag law and a blatant circumvention of accountability, which sets out a roadmap of repression. So, to come back to the whole point about, do we stand aside? I say no, in really simple terms. Desmond Tutu once said, if you are silent in the face of oppression, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. And he was right. Every silent witness, every time there is a silent bystander, those perpetrators, whoever they are incrementally more empowered, and sometimes hugely so. If we don't speak out and stand against human rights violence, we are complicit. So yes, we need to hold them accountable for Hong Kong, for their handling of the pandemic, and for the way that they've treated Uyghur Muslims and are still treating them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for that. We'll be now opening up the floor to questions. So whilst you're maybe mulling them over, I thought I would use and abuse my chair privilege to ask 2 quick questions for participants. Please either raise your hand, type in the chat, by the way, for questions, and please wait to be called. But I thought I would kick things off by asking Ben and Cecilia, which policy that the other person has mentioned today do you agree with? And at the same time, which policy in your mind should definitely be included in the integrated review, is something you want to see in the integrated review published next year? Let's go with Ben first. Oh, sorry, Thomas. Sorry, Thomas. Do you want to? Yep. Yeah, ready when you are, Ben.
Okay, yeah, well, I'm glad to have the opportunity to just clarify on Cecilia's point. I was making the point of the national circumstance that exists not only in the UK but in the West, as there is a fatigue towards international intervention. So it's not my personal opinion. In my personal opinion, I think that China does need to be challenged because we have a situation where a communist force that is, I would argue, more powerful and a greater threat than the Soviet Union is clearly attempting to exert its influence not just domestically but also internationally, and you've seen the very early results of that with the human rights abuses that have been detailed in Hong Kong and in China itself. But I think you can also look beyond the Chinese borders to places like Africa, where China has been involved in the funding of genocide, where China has been involved in the supporting of some very negative and dangerous regimes with the simple aim of extracting the national resources of those countries. And I think those are things that need to be opposed by the United Kingdom, but also by the West collectively. Because if we don't oppose them, then even if you're not concerned about what is going on in China, eventually those concerns will find their way to your door. That is my belief, and particularly in the globalized world we live in. And in fact, I personally and many of my colleagues have come into contact with the CCP. I was giving a talk at Durham University about whether I saw China as a potential threat to the United Kingdom, and the Chinese embassy actually threatened Durham University to shut down the debate. I think that speaks to a regime that is not a partner but is an adversary. So I would agree with Cecilia that it needs to be challenged. I think very careful thought needs to be made as to how that is done, and it must be done in partnership with other nations. As to the point, as to the second question, one of the things that David Cameron, when he came into power in 2010, promised to do was enshrine the military covenant in law. And there are many aspects to the military covenant. But one of the most important is that there'll be no commitment of British troops where British interests are not at stake. And I think in light of what has happened over the past 20 years with Iraq, with Afghanistan, with Libya, if we are going to continue to operate on the world stage militarily, we need to ensure that we are protecting those people that we send, and making sure that their rights and benefits are upheld. Now, work has been done on this. There are now greater legal protections for members of the armed forces than existed previously. But I think there needs to be a very clear covenant enshrined in law, so that those that sign up to the armed forces know exactly what they're signing up for, and know that they're not signing up to take part in a foreign war that is misguided and where there are no British interests at stake. So that's the main thing that I would want to see in the review. But there are many more other things also.
I'm sure we can get into those with some of the questions as well. Cecilia, over to you.
Thanks, Ollie. So with regards to the first question, I think it's now pretty obvious in terms of the fact that Ben and I agree that China should be challenged, and that transparency, accountability, clarity all needs to be, it needs to happen. And whether that's through sanctions, whether that's uniting with a particular bloc to impose those sanctions, whether that is severing ties, applying international pressure, making future deals contingent on whether they stop the forcible incarceration of an ethnic minority and demographic genocide. That all basically needs to happen. So I think it's pretty clear that we agree on that. And with regards to what I'd like to see implemented, mainly transparency, actually. So obviously we're currently reevaluating our position on the world stage. We're reevaluating who our allies are, who our enemies are, although that is a loose term, and who we can make trade deals with, who we cannot, what we can suffer, what we can accept. And these reviews have been basically formed within a 5-year quinquennial cycle to match up with elections. And the thing is, with the past ones, they've been quite kind of all over the place, if I'm honest. They've been not very transparent at all. There's not been clarity over who exactly is participating in the construction of them, who are the key players. So in effect, actually, I'd like to see more transparency about how we're actually going to develop this and what we're going to do generally to countries and governments that disrupt or violate human rights and life in general. So as we reorient ourselves on the world stage, we need a really sober reassessment of our relationships with key allies, security threats, defense partnerships, and multinational alliances. I'd like to see a global facing strategy, but one that is clear and very, very, very strong on any kind of human rights violations, because I know if Labour were in government, things like Saudi Arabia that I've mentioned earlier, and violations such as I've gone through with the Uyghur Muslims, Hong Kongese residents. There was one of the first men arrested in the new national security law was simply arrested for holding a Hong Kongese flag. That was his crime. So we need to be really, really clear on how we're going to say no to that. We need transparency when it comes to the review itself, and we need a clear reassessment of where we stand and a global approach.
That's great. I'm just looking at the chat now, and I think perhaps we can collect a couple here. So there's 2 questions, one from Dritero and one from George. One looking at, will British foreign policy in the future be in line with the US foreign policy on the Western Balkans, or will there be an own agenda? But let's take this as a 2 linked to George's question as well, about the 3 Cs initiative and the kind of aimed at increased cooperation of countries Central and Eastern Europe to kind of counter China's influence there. So maybe let's combine those 2 to look at kind of British foreign policy to Eastern Europe and how that's dealing with threats both from China and also Russia. And then I was also looking ahead, another question for both here. Do you think that the effects of the Trump administration, Brexit, Merkel's soon departure will embolden further nationalist and polarized politics? And what kind of impact will this have is another one. So maybe those 2 questions. So British foreign policy to Eastern and Central Europe, and then the kind of rise of nationalism and polarized politics in the wake of the Trump administration, Brexit, and Merkel's soon departure. Would Cecilia like to kick us off first and then move to Ben?
Sure. I'm just trying to read them all. Okay, so
I mean, if you start with those two questions, and then we can go from there. You can pick and choose. Don't have to answer both. Whichever one there.
Yeah, I was just trying to. Oh, there's the Merkel one. Sorry, that's by Avery Benton. Okay, let me just read that really quickly. Okay, cool. Yeah, okay, so I'll take that, the Trump administration Merkel question first. So thank you, Avery, for that question. I think that's really interesting. It's been huge. There's no denying that. You've got an ex-president who is incredibly misogynistic, who has, I think, actually emboldened Boris, unfortunately, in a really negative way, where you've got kind of Trump calling Mexican people rapists, and then Boris, a few months later, writing in his columns that Muslim women are like letterboxes or mailboxes. You've got, obviously, all the withdrawals that we mentioned earlier from different international organizations, which has stymied aid. It's messed up women's rights, women's autonomy. It's had such far wide-ranging effects that we won't ever be able to calculate them. There's a thing called authority bias. Even if the person in office is completely unqualified, if they speak and they say something, we always subconsciously value it more just because they are in that office, however they got there. And so, yeah, Trump's populism, his brand of hate rhetoric, politics, his divisive approach, the way that he's pitted families, ethnicities against each other, how he's felt so threatened by anything or anyone that is other than someone who looks and thinks like him. Take the Republican Freedom Caucus, for example. Try Googling that. It's a fantastic picture of an all-white male committee signing off maternal rights for women. So it's obviously had a massive effect, and one we will not be able to count. And also, if you look at the fact that when you have a particular kind of person in power, it encourages, obviously, people like them to rise to power and to run for office. When you see a woman running for office or in a position of authority, such as UKPM, many more women start running for office, and you see those effects between generation and generation. And we've also seen the effects in Hungary and Poland. Poland has cracked down on protests against gay rights. Hungary has followed, protests for gay rights, Hungary has followed. You've had the Warszawa, which is the Warsaw, 6 days of protest, followed by Gdansk, Krakow, a load of others, where the church in Poland has tried to rewrite the constitution. And following Trump's direct comments on punishing women for having abortions and how that should be a thing, Poland has basically tested out the same thing in his wake. During a national lockdown and a banning of mass gatherings, the Kaczynski party went ahead and tried to restrict abortion even further, to basically not even include cases where the woman has been raped. So we've seen huge effects is the answer. And ultimately, I can only say that there's hope now with our first female vice president, Kamala Harris, and obviously a man who does have a lot of qualifications to be in office, has been in office, knows what he's doing, and will rejoin international organizations who have credibility, standing, and will be able to coordinate a global response to the pandemic, to the shadow pandemic, to climate change, to security, national defense, and rights all over the world.
Thank you for that, Cecilia. Ben, I think yours will be probably the last comments before I hand over to Thomas, if you want to take either of the questions taken so far. I'm sorry that we didn't get around to Michael, Crouch and Shane. Sorry about that. That's just the way of these things. But after that, I will then hand over, after Ben's comments, to Thomas for the closing remarks. Over to you, Ben.
Thank you. Okay, well, I'll start with the Visegrad nations or Eastern Europe. I speak with a lot of government representatives from that part of the world, and they are just as Eurosceptic as the Brexit movement in the United Kingdom. The problem that they have is that they are also very aware that if they were to leave the European Union, not only would there be an immediate economic shock as a result of that, but it's very likely that they would merely be subsumed by Russia in terms of regional influence. And they had that for a large part of their history, and they very much don't want to go back to those days. So and I think it's clear from their actions within the European Union that they do not agree with the direction of the European Union. They don't want a federal superstate, and they don't want a lot of the hard left policies that are pushed from Brussels onto the constituent nations. However, I think from a UK point of view, unless we can provide an alternative structure, which I don't think is impossible, but it would take some time. I don't think there is much that we can offer Eastern Europe, because of whilst they're in the European Union, we can come to trade agreements with those nations, but they're very restricted in terms of what they can do in terms of foreign policy. They're very restricted in what they can do in terms of domestic policy. If you roll back a few decades, a lot of people don't realise that we effectively left the European Union before, when it was in a different form, and we formed a European free trade agreement between nations like Portugal and the Nordic nations that didn't want to take part in the European community. I think something like that would be possible again. I think what's changed is that we can perhaps look further afield than just the continent of Europe in terms of what the partner nations could be in that. Some people put forward the notion of an Anglosphere. Some people put forward the notion of rebuilding the Commonwealth. And I think there is a viable construct that could eventually see some of the constituent nations of the European Union leave and enter, because it would be more likely to be just about trade rather than imposing political decisions from a centrality on independent nations. I think you've got to remember when you criticise a lot of these nations, and a lot of the nations we criticise are not democratic, like China, but Hungary and Poland have democratically elected governments, as the United States does. Of course, there's a debate about the validity of the election results, but I think from the United Kingdom, we should not be preaching to other nations that where their people have clearly decided on the governments that they want to have. Moving on to the question of Trump and Merkel and nationalism. My view is that Bill Clinton was a very good president. I didn't agree with him on a lot of issues, but if you look at his record, what the economy did during his time in power, and the United States' place in the world during his time in power, I think he moved the country forward in a lot of ways. George W. Bush and Barack Obama, I think, were disastrous presidents for the United States. You had very sluggish growth rates. You had a lot of foreign policy catastrophes that led to the denigration of the United States and its position on the world stage, but also killed millions of people. I think there is this false idea that Barack Obama was some kind of peacemaker, where he, in truth, he dropped more bombs than any other president. Donald Trump is the first president in 40 years not to have started a new war. And also pre-COVID, the growth of the economy was far greater than either Obama or Bush. So I think you rather than taking a sort of high-handed attitude of the United States has made a mistake, I would encourage those on the left to actually examine why Trump won and why someone like Trump may well win again. And it basically comes down to people's lives. People mostly make their decisions on voting as to what their lives are like. They're less interested in foreign policy. They're more interested in whether they are going to prosper over the next few years. And I think Donald Trump offered them a lot of that. I think there's also a curious, a lot of this comes down to nomenclature. What are you calling nationalism? What are you calling patriotism? We have a situation where the third largest party in the United Kingdom is the Scottish Nationalist Party, who freely identify as being Scottish nationalists, obviously. I don't think there's a problem with nationalism in the sense of having a government that focuses on the needs of the domestic population. I think there's been too much Davos man over the last 20 years and not enough focus on the lives of people in Britain.
We might need to bring things to a close now, Ben. So if you want to conclude your wrap up your points, that'd be perfect.
Yeah. So I would simply say that you've got to respect democracy. You've got to respect the democratic decisions of the nations you're talking about, rather than assuming that you know better. And I think that will form a core part of the UK's approach to foreign policy going forward, which is criticising human rights abuses but respecting the sovereignty of other nations.
Thanks for that. I'll hand over to Thomas now for the closing remarks.
Closing remarks sounds a bit formal, but I just want to say thank you very much to everyone for attending. I want to say thank you to Oliver for moderating. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much to Benjamin and Cecilia for speaking. It's been wonderful to hear both of your opinions and see both where they correlate and where they, of course, differ. I really hope that people have taken something away from this to see, well, how is it really that if we're looking at this from different perspectives, how is it that this influences foreign policy? And I think it's important always that we take in mind that when you are situated in a country as a party, you can certainly be internationalist, you can be nationalist, but I don't doubt that from many of the parties that exist that there is a desire to create a better world. What that, of course, then differs between certain parties and between certain lines of thought is what that will constitute. But I think that we've outlined clearly here in this debate that there are different ways of going about this, and this undoubtedly comes down to how we tackle and how we align ourselves towards the other great influencers of the world. And I think that we've kind of tried to understand, well, what is the method of thinking about going about this. So thank you to everyone for coming. I would highly suggest that people attend our next and final event. That's going to be on Friday, where we'll be talking to the Foreign Minister of Zimbabwe and the embassy there. And apart from that, I really have nothing more to say. I really hope everyone enjoyed this.
Thanks very much, Tom, for organising, and for Oliver, really, really smooth moderating, absolutely seamless. If anyone is interested in joining the Fabians or just wants to know a bit more about it, I'll drop my email in the chat. But otherwise, thank you, Ben, for good debate. And yeah, thank you, everyone, for coming. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, likewise, I'd like to echo that, and I thank everyone for their contributions. I can see some good questions up there. I'm sorry we couldn't get around to all of them, but it's always a pleasure to reach out and speak to those on campus, and it's frustrating not to be able to do it in person. but I hope we can get back to that sort of thing soon.
We will make sure to include everyone that that we're speaking here, and we will post that on our website and our Facebook. So everyone just keep following there, and then you'll be able to join up to whoever you feel had the better arguments for you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Ben and Cecilia.
Thanks.
And thank you, Thomas, for organising.